The desert was silent except for the wind. A line of shadows stood waiting, men holding their breath in the half-light before dawn. Out on the horizon a tower loomed, with something hidden inside it, something that pulsed with a promise and a threat. No army stood ready here, no columns of tanks or formations of bombers. This battlefield was invisible, yet its outcome would change the fate of the world. At exactly 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, the sky split apart. A blinding flash, brighter than the sun, turned night into day and carved shadows into the desert floor. The shockwave followed, rolling over the men like the roar of a world ending. The atomic age had begun, but that moment was not just a triumph of science. It was the end of a mission so secret that even many who served it never knew its name. Hollywood tells us the story of the Manhattan Project in flashes of genius, brilliant scientists, daring experiments, a race against time. Yet the truth was darker, stranger, and far more human. It was not a single story of invention, but of spies in the shadows, soldiers guarding what they did not understand, and scientists torn between discovery and destruction. It was a mission that began in whispers and ended in a fireball. If you want to uncover how this hidden journey, born in secrecy, shaped by fear, and forged in war, led to the atomic age, stay with us. Subscribe, share, and join us as we walk into the silence behind the blast and reveal the mission that redefined humanity's power over life and death. In the closing years of the 1930s, the world balanced on a knife's edge. Across Europe, nations braced under the rise of Hitler's Reich. The march of the Wehrmacht had already broken treaties and borders, and the Luftwaffe darkened skies that were once safe. But in quiet laboratories, far from the clatter of boots and the rumble of tanks, something else stirred, something invisible, smaller than an atom, yet powerful enough to unmake cities. The discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 by Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann spread quickly among physicists. At first, it was treated as a scientific marvel, a doorway into the mysteries of the universe. The idea that splitting uranium atoms could release staggering amounts of energy fascinated researchers. In another world, it might have led only to theories, perhaps new ways of generating power decades later. But this was not another world. This was Europe on the brink of war. And among scientists, the question spread like wildfire. What if Germany weaponized this discovery first? Hungarian physicists Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner were among the first to feel the weight of dread. Both had fled fascism and knew too well what it meant for knowledge to fall into the hands of a dictator. They realized that if the Reich could harness fission, the result would be a weapon unlike anything imagined. One blast could equal thousands of tons of TNT. A single bomb could flatten London, Paris, or Moscow. The scale of destruction shifted from the imaginable to the apocalyptic. Szilard, Wigner, and fellow refugee Edward Teller sought to sound the alarm. But who would listen? Scientists spoke in equations, leaders in armies. Bridging that gap was nearly impossible until they found a messenger the world would hear. They turned to Albert Einstein. Though Einstein himself had no direct role in nuclear weapons research, his name carried a gravity no politician could ignore. In August 1939, he signed a letter drafted by Szilard and addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The message was clear. Germany might build a bomb of unimaginable power, and the United States had to act before it was too late. That letter reached Roosevelt's desk as storm clouds gathered in Europe. Days later, German forces invaded Poland, igniting the Second World War. For Roosevelt, the warning was no longer an academic puzzle, but a potential weapon of survival. He authorized an initial investigation, cautious, limited, but the seed was planted. From that moment, science was bound to war in a way it had never been before. In Germany, nuclear research did begin, though it lacked the urgency the Allies feared. But in America, the whispers grew louder. Reports trickled in from occupied Europe, rumors of uranium mines under German control, and questions of whether the Reich's scientists were already racing toward the same goal. Intelligence was fragmented, but paranoia magnified every detail. The Allies could not risk assuming otherwise. To fall behind was to risk annihilation. Meanwhile, in Britain, physicists gathered under a project codenamed Tube Alloys, exploring the possibilities of nuclear weapons with limited resources. Their work would later merge with American efforts, fusing two nations into one of the greatest scientific collaborations in history. Across the Atlantic, committees and subcommittees formed, names that sounded bureaucratic but carried the seeds of destiny. The Advisory Committee on Uranium, the Briggs Committee. Few outside those circles knew their purpose. Even fewer understood the stakes. The whispers of fear drove everything. Men who had once dreamed of pure discovery now found themselves imagining mushroom clouds rising over cities. Equations scribbled on blackboards became predictions of death tolls. Science was no longer just curiosity. It was survival. And as the war spread across Europe, as France fell, as Britain stood alone under nightly bombardment, the whispers turned into demands. If Hitler could be stopped by this weapon, then no effort, no cost, no secrecy could be spared. By 1941, the mission had grown beyond letters and committees. It demanded a structure, a name, and a veil of secrecy so deep that even those who served it would not know the full picture. The Manhattan Engineer District, soon called simply the Manhattan Project, was born. Its purpose was singular, to take the whispers of fear and turn them into a weapon before the enemy could. What began as a scientific curiosity had transformed into a race against shadows. A race where no one knew exactly how far the enemy had advanced or if the finish line would come too late. But one thing was certain, the age of innocence in science was over. Every discovery from here on would carry not only wonder, but the weight of destruction. The Manhattan Project did not look like war at first glance. There were no trenches, no roaring artillery, no soldiers charging across muddy fields. Instead, it looked like a scattering of buildings rising in deserts, forests and valleys, anonymous compounds guarded by barbed wire and armed patrols. Inside those fences, some of the greatest minds of the 20th century gathered, men and women pulled from across the world, all bound together by secrecy and a shared urgency. They came from everywhere. Refugees who had fled Europe brought knowledge forged in universities that now lay in ruins. American physicists, many barely older than their students, left behind classrooms for military badges and locked laboratories. British scientists crossed the Atlantic under Operation Alsos, carrying calculations and theories to merge with American resources. At Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, cultures collided. Soldiers accustomed to discipline and hierarchy clashed with scientists used to freedom of thought. The tension between them became a rhythm of the project. Science pulled forward by curiosity. The military tightening the leash of secrecy and control. Los Alamos, hidden in the New Mexico desert, became the heart of the project. It was chosen for its isolation, a plateau surrounded by mountains and empty sky, a place where silence was easier to maintain. There, under the direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the gathering of minds turned into a storm of ideas. Oppenheimer, once a dreamy professor with a love of poetry, became a leader of a new kind of army, an army of physicists. He recruited giants of science, Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, names that belonged in textbooks, not military rosters. They walked through dusty streets and wooden barracks, chalk-stained hands tucked into government-issued coats, carrying equations that could decide the war. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was different, a sprawling industrial city built almost overnight. Its streets lined with houses for workers who barely knew what they were building. Thousands of men and women operated strange machines called calutrons, separating uranium isotopes day and night. Many believed they were helping the war effort, but few were told exactly how. "Just do your job," their supervisor said, "and don't ask questions." In that secrecy, America built one of the largest hidden cities in the world, where even neighbors could not speak of their work. At Hanford, Washington, the story was stranger still. Along the Columbia River, vast reactors rose to produce plutonium, a substance so new that few had ever seen it. Entire towns were displaced, land cleared, rivers redirected, all to create a material no one outside the fences had heard of. Workers there handled glowing rods of uranium, monitored by soldiers who enforced silence as strictly as safety. The scale was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of people worked on the Manhattan Project, yet only a fraction knew its true purpose. Secrecy was enforced with posters, slogans, and threats. Loose lips sink ships became more than a phrase. It was a warning painted on walls, printed on pay stubs, whispered by guards. Scientists themselves often knew only fragments of the puzzle, their work locked behind layers of classification. The project was a labyrinth, with pieces scattered across the country, each piece guarded by silence, all of it converging on the promise of a single weapon. For the scientists, the atmosphere was surreal. They argued over equations by day, then gathered at night for lectures, concerts, or quiet walks beneath desert stars. Some were exhilarated. Never before had so many brilliant minds worked side by side, free to pursue ideas with resources beyond imagination. Others were haunted, aware that every chalk mark on a board, every calculation that closed a gap, was a step closer to unleashing something they could barely understand. Yet beneath the debates and theories, there was a sense of inevitability. The war demanded progress. Reports from Europe spoke of mass graves, burning cities, and weapons that grew deadlier each month. If the Manhattan Project faltered, if Germany succeeded first, the cost would be unimaginable. That urgency pressed down on every man and woman inside the fences, from Oppenheimer to the anonymous worker feeding uranium into a machine she didn't understand. By 1943, the gathering of minds had turned into something more, a machine of its own, fueled by secrecy, driven by fear and aimed at the future. The scientists were no longer just explorers of knowledge. They were soldiers in a war, fought with equations, calculations, and particles. They built not for curiosity, but for survival. And though they could not see the future, they felt it pressing closer with every solved equation. Every test completed, every pound of uranium or plutonium produced. The world outside saw only fences and guards. Inside, the Manhattan Project was becoming something far larger than its creators realized. A mission that would not only end a war, but open a new age. An age where mankind's greatest weapon was not steel or fire, but the atom itself. As the laboratories in New Mexico, Tennessee and Washington roared with activity. Another kind of war brewed in silence, one fought not with equations or reactors, but with shadows, suspicion, and espionage. The Manhattan Project was never just about building the bomb. It was also about outrunning an enemy whose progress could not be seen, only guessed at. And in that uncertainty, paranoia flourished. From the earliest days, leaders of the project were haunted by one question: how far had Germany advanced? The very idea that Nazi scientists might be racing along the same path was enough to keep generals awake at night. Werner Heisenberg, one of the greatest physicists of the age, remained inside Germany, his work cloaked in secrecy. Rumors swirled of laboratories in Berlin, of uranium mines seized in Czechoslovakia, of reactors hidden in caves. Each rumor fed the conviction that the Reich was dangerously close to the same discovery the Allies were pursuing. To answer that fear, intelligence agents fanned across Europe. Under the Alsos mission, Allied teams followed the advancing armies, searching for laboratories, papers, and scientists. They seized uranium stockpiles, captured equipment, and interrogated German physicists. Some missions ended in silence, finding little more than abandoned notes. Others uncovered proof that Germany's efforts were fragmented, underfunded, and far behind. But this knowledge came late. For most of the war, The Allies assumed the worst, and that assumption drove the Manhattan Project at breakneck speed. Inside the fences of Los Alamos, suspicion took another form. With thousands of workers, scientists, and soldiers involved, secrecy was a fragile shield. Every letter home was censored. Every conversation could be overheard. Posters warned that even a careless word might betray them. Yet despite the precautions, secrets still slipped through the cracks. Some left not by accident, but by design. Soviet agents had infiltrated the project, slipping into the very heart of the most guarded mission in history. Men like Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist, worked inside the project by day and passed critical details to Soviet handlers by night. Others, like Theodore Hall, a young prodigy, secretly funneled information eastward. To the scientists who shared their work, these were colleagues, trusted and brilliant. Only later would history reveal that they had carried equations and blueprints across invisible borders, ensuring that the atomic age would not belong to one nation alone. For those inside Los Alamos, the sense of being watched was constant. Military police patrolled the streets. Guards checked every paper, every drawing, every note scribbled in haste. Scientists grumbled under the restrictions, some resenting the army's tight grip. Yet they also knew the stakes. A single leak could unravel the years of work, could hand victory to an enemy who showed no mercy. It was a prison of necessity, one that confined not only bodies, but words, thoughts, and fears. This climate of suspicion seeped into the work itself. Decisions carried not just scientific weight, but political shadows. Should research focus on uranium or plutonium? Should resources be poured into one path or split in case one failed? Behind every choice lingered the thought, what if Germany had already solved this problem? What if they were ahead? The pressure was unrelenting, the race as much against imagined progress as against reality. Meanwhile, the war raged on. News of battles reached the scientists in fragments: Stalingrad, Normandy, the Pacific Islands. Each headline was a reminder that time was measured not only in months, but in lives. Every delay meant more soldiers lost, more cities in flames. That urgency, mixed with the constant suspicion of spies and leaks, created an atmosphere both electrifying and suffocating. Scientists joked about living in a cage, but the laughter was nervous. They were caged with an idea that could unmake the world. By late 1944, the truth about Germany's nuclear program finally became clear. The Alsos mission captured Heisenberg and other leading physicists. Interrogations revealed that Germany had not come close to building a bomb. Their efforts had been scattered, starved of resources, and sabotaged by bureaucracy. The nightmare that had haunted the project for years, a German atomic bomb, had never truly existed. The relief was immense, but it came too late to stop the momentum. The Manhattan Project was already too vast, too far, too invested to turn back. Now the race shifted. It was no longer against Germany. It was against the calendar, the war in the Pacific, and the fear that Japan's resistance could drag on for years, costing millions of lives. And silently, it was also against another shadow, the Soviet Union, ally in the fight against Hitler, but rival in the world that would follow. The bomb was no longer just a weapon of war. It was becoming a weapon of diplomacy, of power, of the future. The scientists, many of them still unaware of the full geopolitical stakes, pressed on. They had lived for years under suspicion and secrecy, racing against an enemy that did not exist. Now they were building something that did. The shadows had shaped the mission, but the fire was still to come. The desert of New Mexico stretched in silence, a barren plain beneath a canopy of stars. In the months leading up to that night, Los Alamos had transformed from a secluded scientific outpost into a crucible of tension. Every calculation, every gram of plutonium or uranium purified, every sleepless night at a chalkboard had been leading here to a single moment of truth. They called it Trinity, a code name chosen by Oppenheimer, inspired by a line of poetry, but to the men who prepared the device it was more than a test. It was the question that haunted them all. Had they built a weapon that would change war forever, or a machine that would fail in silence? The bomb itself stood atop a steel tower, a strange, ungainly sphere wrapped in wires and detonators. To the soldiers who guarded it, the object seemed almost unremarkable, like a crude piece of machinery. But the scientists knew what was inside. The product of years of secret labor, a core of plutonium so carefully engineered that a fraction of a second's delay in its implosion could mean failure. They called it the gadget. The name was deliberately plain, as if disguising its significance might make it less terrifying. As dawn approached on July 16, 1945, the desert filled with tension. Observers took positions miles away, crouching in bunkers or lying flat against the sand. Some wore welding goggles, others clutched makeshift filters, all unsure of what awaited them. Rumors had swirled among the ranks in the days before. Would the explosion ignite the atmosphere? Would it set fire to the desert and burn uncontrollably? Few truly believed it, yet the fear lingered, a whisper in the back of every mind. At 5:29 a.m., the countdown ended. The flash came first, an eruption of light so blinding it seemed to tear a hole in the fabric of the world. For an instant, those watching thought the sun had risen in the wrong part of the sky. Shadows etched themselves into the ground, burned onto walls, seared into the eyes of men, even through heavy glass. The blast followed, a roar that rolled across the desert, flattening towers, shattering windows miles away, shaking the earth beneath their feet. A mushroom cloud rose, churning upward, boiling with fire and ash, reaching higher and higher, as if clawing its way into the heavens. Men who had worked years for this moment stood in stunned silence. Some cheered, voices breaking with triumph, relief, even joy. Others turned away, struck dumb by the enormity of what they had unleashed. Edward Teller slipped on darkened glasses and watched with awe. Enrico Fermi, ever the pragmatist, tore scraps of paper, dropped them into the wind, and measured how far they drifted from the blast to estimate its force. Oppenheimer himself stood transfixed, the light reflecting in his glasses, later recalling words from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The bomb had worked. More than worked, it had exceeded expectations. The yield was far greater than many had predicted, equal to thousands of tons of TNT. The desert floor at ground zero turned to glass, a new substance later called trinitite, fused by heat beyond comprehension. The steel tower was vaporized, reduced to twisted fragments. And in that moment, the atomic age was no longer a theory, no longer an equation on a blackboard. It was real. It was fire, yet triumph carried its shadow. In the silence after the roar, many felt unease settle in. They had succeeded, but at what cost? What had they brought into the world? The project had begun in fear of Germany's bomb, but Germany was defeated now. The Reich had fallen months earlier. The weapon they had built was no longer for Hitler. Its target would be Japan. And with its success, the decision of how and whether to use it shifted from the scientists to the generals and politicians. For the men who witnessed Trinity, the memory never left them. Some described it as beautiful, others as horrifying. Many could not find words at all, but all of them knew, as the cloud climbed higher into the sky, that history had changed. There was no going back. The secrets locked behind fences and barbed wire were now carved into the earth itself, burned into the sand of the desert, written in the light that had blinded them. The mission had succeeded. The bomb was real, and soon the world would know. When the cloud over the Trinity Desert finally drifted into memory, the weapon it announced did not rest long in silence. Within weeks, crates carrying its lethal heart were loaded into bomb bays, and the world hurtled toward its first encounter with atomic fire in war. Hiroshima came first, on August 6, 1945. The bomber Enola Gay lifted into the sky carrying Little Boy, a uranium bomb born from the endless machines of Oak Ridge. The city below was just waking when the weapon detonated. In one blinding flash, tens of thousands of lives vanished. The heat seared shadows onto stone, vaporized bodies, and left survivors wandering in ruins that no longer resembled a city. 3 days later came Nagasaki. This time it was Fat Man, a plutonium device perfected through the labor of Los Alamos and Hanford. The hillsides around the port city amplified the destruction, channeling the shockwave through valleys, toppling buildings, and igniting fires that burned through rubble. The war that had consumed the globe for 6 years ended in less than a week. Japan surrendered, and the world entered a silence more profound than any victory parade. For the leaders who had ordered the bombings, the logic was brutal but clear. An invasion of Japan threatened to cost millions of lives. Cities already lay in ashes from conventional firebombing. To them, the bomb was not only a weapon, but a message to Japan, to the world, and perhaps most of all, to the Soviet Union. Yet for the men who had built it, the aftermath was not so simple. Scientists who once cheered the Trinity test now felt unease twisting in their stomachs. What had begun as a mission to prevent Nazi Germany from seizing ultimate power had ended with mushroom clouds over Asian cities and a new balance of terror hanging over humanity. At Los Alamos, some tried to justify it. Others fell into quiet regret. Oppenheimer himself, once called the father of the bomb, became its most troubled prophet. Meeting with President Truman months later, he admitted, "I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, offended, dismissed him. The split was clear. The military saw victory. The scientists saw consequences. The legacy of the mission was larger than either could control. In the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Cold War was born. The Soviet Union, already seeded with Manhattan Project secrets through spies like Klaus Fuchs, accelerated its own program. By 1949, they tested their first atomic bomb, ensuring that America's monopoly on nuclear power would not last. From there, the race quickened. Bigger bombs, hydrogen weapons 1,000 times stronger, missiles that could cross oceans in minutes. The secret mission that had begun in the desert shadows of New Mexico spread into an arms race that defined the second half of the 20th century. Yet the legacy was not only political, it was philosophical, even existential. Humanity had unlocked a power once reserved for nature itself. The force that burned in stars now sat inside bombs on airstrips and submarines. For the first time, mankind had the ability to end its own story, not in centuries or decades, but in minutes. Every soldier, every civilian, every child on Earth now lived under the shadow of decisions made in secret laboratories between 1942 and 1945. Still, there were other legacies, quieter and stranger. Nuclear power plants rose from the same principles, promising energy that could light cities without the smoke of coal. Medical treatments emerged from the study of radiation. Even in destruction, knowledge could not be contained. The atom had been split, and its consequences spilled into every corner of life. But the darker legacy remained strongest. At Hiroshima's Peace Memorial, the shadow of a man burned into stone still testifies to that morning. Survivors, called hibakusha, carried scars on their skin and in their memories, reminders that the bomb was not just numbers on a chalkboard or a cloud in the desert sky, but pain etched into flesh and bone. Hollywood, years later, would dramatize the Manhattan Project with scenes of brilliant scientists, tense countdowns and triumphant explosions. What those stories often miss is the silence that followed. The silence of children searching for lost families in ruins. The silence of scientists staring at their hands, wondering what they had unleashed. The silence of a world that realized, in one terrible moment, that wars were no longer bound by conventional limits. The secret mission had succeeded beyond imagination. It ended the war. It prevented Hitler's scientists from claiming ultimate power. It secured a new world order with America at its head. But it also shattered something more fragile, the belief that progress was always a gift. The same minds that had once unlocked the atom for discovery had now harnessed it for annihilation, That is the paradox of the Manhattan Project. It was a triumph of intellect, of coordination, of human determination. And it was a tragedy of foresight, because even in victory, it ensured that humanity would forever live with a weapon capable of ending all wars by ending all life. Today, the deserts of New Mexico are quiet. The test site lies empty, a scar on the earth where glass still glitters faintly under the sun. Tourists walk the ground where men once crouched in fear of the unknown. Yet even as the wind whistles across the plain, the echoes remain. The light that tore the sky open in 1945 has never truly faded. It lives in missile silos, in submarine hulls, in the diplomacy of nations, in the nightmares of those who imagine what another flash might look like. The Manhattan Project was more than a mission. It was a crossing, a step into an age where knowledge could no longer be separated from consequence, where science and war fused into something indivisible. It was the moment when humanity first glimpsed its own end and chose to keep walking toward it.